In this chapter, we've now fully transitioned to talking about macroeconomics, and now we're going to talk specifically about GDP, or as the chapter title points out, that gross domestic product is the way that we measure national output as well as national income. Okay, I'm just going to skip over the objectives here. Um, all of this is data that's collected by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, a government agency, and they basically just look at everything that's produced and count those things. And the reason why it's capturing both income as well as products is that basically whatever is produced has to be paid for, and so that would generate an income, a level of income, and so measuring one necessarily measures the other. And the shorthand way that economists then talk about this, and the way that you've probably heard about it in the news or that someone has talked about it, would be gross domestic product. And what gross domestic product does, or what it represents, is the market value, right? So let's underline the key parts of this phrase here. That it's the market value of final goods and services located within a country. Those are kind of the key parts there. Final good and service, that means that, so for instance, if you buy a new car, it obviously comes with tires and a full gas tank, things like that. We don't count each of those individual things. We just count the whole new car. What's the value of that whole new car? Well, the price that it sold for, the market value of it. And we're looking at stuff that's produced within the country itself. Okay. And you see part of this description then right here. Again, final good and service means that we're looking at the final thing produced. So things like intermediate goods are not counted because they are contained within the final good. If you didn't use the final good or service, then you could add up all of the intermediate goods. You would just need to keep adding them up, and they should then theoretically equal the value of the new car. But if you counted the final good or service and you counted an intermediate good, you would in essence be double counting. Um, and that's what this first bullet point indicates right here. That instead of just adding up the final goods or service, you could add up all the production levels, the products produced at each production level. You could just add those all up. It should equal the same thing though, and it's obviously a lot more difficult to add that up. So here's the example. We could look at a gallon of gasoline that sells for $4, right? So we could just say, what does Costco gas charge for a gallon of gas? Let's say it's $4. And if you didn't want to count that $4 and you wanted to count it for all the stages, then you would have to add in all the things that have to happen for there to be a gallon of gas. Drilled out of the ground, refined, shipped, and sold. Add each of those up, and it would equal the same thing. Hopefully. We're not looking at old goods. We're only looking at things currently in production. And so, actually, just today, I sold my old used car. There was no contribution to GDP by me selling my old car because it was a new car back in 2007. That would have been when it would have was counted. Um, GDP is also not going to change um, just when um, money is given to someone without something in return. What does that second bullet point mean? Well, for example, with something like Social Security check that maybe like your grandparents get, or something like that, or maybe even you get if there's a disabled member in the family. That Social Security check is not part of GDP because there was nothing done. Um, there's nothing exchanged for that money. Now, the GDP, as we've talked about it, is only counting the stuff that's produced within um, the country. Um, the other way to think about it would be with something called gross national product rather than gross domestic product. And for gross national product, what we're looking at there is we're just looking at what a country's citizens produce, no matter where they live in the world. That's pretty difficult to calculate that because people truly do live all over. But it is another way to um, try to measure the productive capabilities of a country. In this case, it would be of that country's citizens. It's not really that useful, though. What's most useful is just looking at the production within the country itself. And so there are two ways to calculate this. One way called the expenditure approach, and the other called the income approach. And in the expenditure approach, what we're looking at here is what's spent. And we look primarily at four categories: consumption, plus investment, plus government spending, plus net exports, which is exports minus, sorry, it's really bad, which is exports minus imports. This G again is government spending. I standing for investment. And C standing for consumption. So we can add all these up, and that's our expenditure approach. Alternatively, for the income approach, we look at income that comes from wages, rents, interest, and profits. If we add all these up, it should equal what this is. It's just a different side of the coin. So this is just kind of what I just wrote on the other slide. Again, expenditure approach would be adding up four categories: consumption, that would be household spending on goods, plus investment, that would be what households and businesses spend for new capital, equipment, inventory, new homes. Then you've got government spending. So that government spending, if they build a new bridge, they build a new library, that kind of stuff. And then you have net exports, which is just exports minus imports. We don't need to do this. I don't want you to get distracted by. Well, let me just talk about it briefly. Not only did I sell my old car, I also sold an old Nintendo Wii. Remember Nintendo Wii? Right? Super Mario Kart, stuff like that. I sold it for $180. So if you've got one sitting around, you should totally sell it. Um, but eBay did charge me mm, about $20 or so as a service fee to sell it. So that would obviously be something that gets added to GDP, but um, not the rest of the amount that was earned by me for selling my Wii. Okay. So you can see part of this here for the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is as of almost 4 years ago. Jeez. Um, let's just use the data though right now because we do get a few things from it. Namely, that consumption represents almost 70%, with the vast majority of that coming from services. Investment represents about 16%. Government spending, about the same amount, 17%. And net exports, negative 2.9. It's negative because the imports are actually larger than the exports. Imports are what we buy from the rest of the world. Exports are what we sell to the rest of the world. What's nice about this table is it gives us a pretty good approach to understanding um, just kind of the nature of our economy. How does it look? This gives us a pretty good understanding of that. So, consumption, as you saw, is broken down um, into several categories. Again, services are the largest part of it. The other parts of it would be personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. This would just be um, when we talk about the personal consumption expenditures, those amounts are, or the PCE, would be on durable goods, stove, oven, refrigerator, vehicles, things like that. Non durable goods, food, um, soft drinks, gasoline, clothing, yeah, sure. And then you've got the services. Um, like you paying your tuition for this class. That would be a service that I am delivering to you. Then, under gross domestic investment, again, the three big things would be non residential investment, residential investment, and then inventory as well. And I'm not sure why they're not. Oh, sorry, it's on the next slide. Inventories. So, if we look at non residential investment, this would be what businesses spend on buildings, equipment, things like that. Residential investment, that would be what individuals spend on a new home, apartment building, storage unit, things like that. And then probably the most volatile component of investment, as taught to us by Keynes, is inventory levels. Inventories represent a firm building more than is needed for sales in a given quarter. That would cause a growth in inventories. If a business slows down its production levels and it's still selling the same amount, that would be a way it could draw down its inventory. Why a business decides to um, build up an inventory can either be unexpected or part of the plan. It would be unexpected. Um, it would be unexpected if the firm, suddenly had a reduction in sales. So if it unexpectedly had a reduction in sales, that would cause the firm to build up inventory levels. On the other hand, if it's expecting more demand in the future because it really thinks its product is going to take off, it may want to build up its inventory in anticipation of more sales. Sometimes we even see this with companies that sell like seasonal goods, right? A company that makes Halloween costumes builds up its inventories in September because it knows in November it's not going to be selling too many witches costumes, probably. And then that investment amount um, can also change based on the depreciation. So the depreciation would be the investment wearing out. Most of the time, we hear of something like depreciation when we talk about like car, like right that a car depreciates the moment you drive it off the lot. Well, that is true, and also it's a way that we see capital losing some of its value pretty quickly. Um, the This is kind of just an interesting discussion here, and if we were taking this class in person, we probably would talk about this a bit more in class. But what this basically indicates here that depreciation is different for different kinds of goods. Um, So one example, we know cars obviously depreciate pretty quickly. This is when we're talking about computers, also depreciating pretty quickly. And what that would mean is that every year there is depreciation. We need to keep subtracting it from the investment, the overall investment, right here, so that we're left with our net investment right here. Government spending. Government has to be buying a good or service for it to be counted here. The government just handing out money is not part of government spending. And certainly paying the government taxes is not part of GDPs either. The government needs to be buying some good or service in some way, shape, or form, either at the federal level, the state level, or the local level, right? You right now are a public university, and that public university, right, is spending money to build the campus, spending money to, um, you know, build a university. That money being spent would be represented here in the government spending category. And then finally, we have net exports. The difference again between exports and imports. Exports, what we sell to the rest of the world, imports being what we buy from the rest of the world. We are a net importer, meaning we buy more from the rest of the world than we sell to the rest of the world. And so that would mean that for the United States, our net exports number will be negative. Okay. So remember that the income approach gets us the same number as the expenditure approach. And the expenditure approach, again, is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. That number is equal to this. The adding up national income plus compensation of employees plus proprietors' income plus rental income. Um, National income would just be what people earn for selling factors of production, such as labor. That national income that um, is earned by selling labor, that's our compensation of employees. So national income equals either selling your labor, that'd be your compensation of employees, plus the income of the business owner, plus the rental income. Rental income meaning from lending out a building of some kind. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so sorry, just catching back up here. So when we look at the corporate profits, that one should be pretty um, obvious. The corporate profits would just be what the corporation earns as net income. The net interest would be the interest that's paid by businesses for loans on bonds or direct loans from banks. Then we've got what's considered the indirect taxes minus the subsidies. These would be things like sales taxes, um, other kinds of license fees. Now, the reason why it's called indirect is because there's no good or service that's actually exchanged for it. So it's not like it's not directly tied to receiving a good or service by paying that tax. Um, then you've got payments um, within the business. Um, and then finally, we have the unlikely situation where a government might earn a profit, although we can't call it a profit because a government is basically a non for profit. So we would just call it a surplus. And so when we look at that and we look at those shares, the majority of it is compensation to employees, making up about 62% of that. And then you've got your rest here. So as you can see, national income, it's a bit more complicated because you're adding all of these up. Which is why, generally speaking, we like to use the expenditure approach because there we're just doing C plus I plus G plus NX. It's a little bit easier just to do adding up those four things rather than these eight. It's twice as easy. The when we're still looking at that income approach, the other thing we have to do would be we could look at the level of depreciation, subtract that from the gross national product. That'd give us a net national product. So again, remember there's GDP versus GNP. GDP is stuff produced within that country's borders. GNP would be stuff produced by the country's citizens, no matter where they live. If we took the gross domestic product and we subtracted from that the depreciation, we'd get the net national product. Yeah, there's a statistical discrepancy. I'm not even sure why they're putting that here. It's not. It's not. Um, it's there. It makes the numbers work out because, as you'll see here, we can use GDP to get to everything else. This is a bit more complicated, and I'm not going to test you on being able to recreate this kind of problem like this. Um, I think it becomes a little bit tedious. But just be aware, from GDP, you can take into account other things to arrive at GNP, net national product, and national income. And what we can get from that as well, using the income approach, we can, one of the things that we can get from that is how much the saving level is. Because what we would do is take the national income or the personal income, subtract out the taxes. That's going to get us our disposable income. Then we could look, um, we could subtract from that after tax income, we could subtract personal spending. That would give us personal savings. And then the personal savings rate would simply be the percentage. And so you can see that here. National income minus the taxes. Personal income minus the taxes, getting us to disposable personal income, minus what's actually spent by consumers, plus interest payments and transfer payments, gets us our personal savings. So everything does follow with simple addition and subtraction. Okay, let's not worry about this. I will not be testing you on anything like that. And what that leads us to is discussing about or making sure we're aware of the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. So, what we know is present always in the economy is some level of inflation, which means the prices are going up every year. Now, remember, what is GDP? It's the final market value of goods and services. So, if the prices are going up, GDP is going up, right? So, the way to look at this a little bit differently would be like this: it'd be the prices of all the goods times the quantities of all the goods. But then, if prices go up, let's say, and quantity stayed the same, then nominal GDP would go up. So nominal GDP can increase because prices increased, because quantity increased, or because both increased. And obviously, that's getting it a little messy, which is why economists tend to want to look at real GDP instead. So then the question is how do we calculate the real GDP? Well, to calculate the real GDP, the biggest thing we need some base year. We need some year that we're going to keep the prices always at that price level over time. And then we'll allow the quantities to change to be able to arrive at the real GDP. And so you can see here you can see the quantity levels for year one and then for year two. So here we're seeing an increase, a decrease, and an increase. And so see the messiness of the prices? Here they're falling, here they're dramatically increasing, here they're increasing as well. And from a nominal GDP level, you see a pretty big change. But look at what happens if we look at the year 2 quantities but the year 1 price. For real GDP, it only changes when the quantity changes. And that's the only time it'll change. Okay. Once you calculate the real GDP, so let's just do a review here. So if we said we're calculating real GDP with year 1 being the base year, then real GDP in year 1 is going to be the price in year 1 times the quantity in year 1, which will be the same as nominal GDP. So in the base year, if year 1 is our base year, then real GDP and nominal GDP are the same. Real GDP in year 2 would be P1 times Q2. Real GDP in year 3 would be P1 times Q3. Nominal GDP see P1 Q1. GDP in year nominal GDP in year 2 would now be P2 Q2. GDP in year 3 would be P3 times Q3. See here, everything is changing here. The price is held constant so that we really are only looking at the changes in the Qs. Don't worry about this. This is a bit more complicated than you need it to be. Now, GDP is not a perfect measure. One of the problems of GDP is that it doesn't take into account bad things that happen, right? If you think about it, crime helps GDP. If I steal someone's car, then someone's going to need to buy a new car. That's helping the economy. If a fire burns down my house, I have to rebuild my house. Also, not included in GDP are things that, leisure, resting, going outside and enjoying nature. None of that would lead to increases in the real GDP. GDP also is not going to count any non-market activities. So non-market activities would be, well, today I actually spent most of my day. It's around 11:43 p.m. I spent most of my day today watching my kids. I don't regret it, but at the same time, I did not contribute to GDP in any way. Watching them. And then finally, the GDP doesn't say anything about how things are distributed. And we obviously could be very concerned about how GDP is distributed among others. What else is really... that's pretty much it for this chapter. I don't want to get too detailed here in these last things. As I already said about the informal economy, that's not going to be counted as part of GDP. But GDP is something that economists do keep very close track of. So understanding it is going to be important for understanding the general performance of the economy, and as we'll see in later chapters, whether we need to use some form of fiscal or monetary policy to fix the economy.